Skeletons don't speak, but tonight, one nun swears they did. Welcome to Midnight Radio Drama. I am your host, Wilfred. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Hearing from you makes this journey special. The story starts here. The Flaxborough Museum of Civic Antiquities was not by general agreement an institution that quickened pulses. Its Roman coins, 3 badly rubbed, medieval pottery, largely restored with glue, and taxidermy, foxes, arranged in what was once thought to be lifelike pursuit of rabbits, were chiefly endured by visiting schoolchildren and foreign tourists who had taken the wrong turning from the coast road. It therefore came as something of a surprise when, on a Thursday afternoon damp enough to flatten any ambitions towards leisure, a nun was observed talking earnestly to the skeleton of a Victorian philanthropist, Sister Isidora, a tall, spare woman with the kind of gaze that had once persuaded mill girls to sign abstinence pledges, had positioned herself before the glass case containing the remains of Tobias Wraxall, benefactor of the Flaxborough Poor Relief Fund, and was audibly whispering. The attendant, Mrs. Thursby, who prided herself on never having permitted so much as a toffee wrapper past the museum threshold, regarded the nun with horrified fascination. Mrs. Thursby had often wondered whether the bones, wired together in a faintly apologetic pose, had any effect on visitors. "Children snigger, gentlemen cough, and ladies look away," she had concluded. But never before had the deceased been treated as a confidant. Sister Isidora's murmurs were low, but one phrase caught the attendant's ear. "You will not be forgotten." The nun straightened, crossed herself with brisk finality, and departed with the solemnity of one leaving a confessional. By tea-time, of course, Mrs. Thursby had confided her experience to Mr. Appleyard, who ran the stationer's next door and who enjoyed a reputation for knowing precisely what went on in Flaxborough before it did. By 6 o'clock, Miss Lucy Teatime, lately resident and never averse to a morsel of scandal, was elaborating upon the incident over her gin and tonic at the Hand and Racket. Not so much whispering, she informed her audience of retired solicitors and haberdashers, as negotiating. One could see it in her lips. She was making terms with the dead. The matter might have remained a comic anecdote had not the following morning brought news of a most inconvenient development. The case containing Tobias Wraxall's skeleton was found empty. The glass was unbroken, the lock untouched, and the entire exhibit, bones, stand, label, and an elderly moth that had lodged itself inside, had disappeared. The curator, Mr. Sproul, pale and affronted, could only stammer that nothing of the kind had occurred since the institution's founding in 1893. A skeleton, he pointed out with tragic dignity, was not an object one could mislay between cataloguing and closing time. By elevenses, the town was humming with speculation. A prank by grammar school boys? A ritual theft? Or, as Mr. Appleyard murmured with relish, to anyone who bought 2 envelopes and a sheet of blotting paper, "The nun knows more than her rosary lets on." At noon precisely, Inspector Purbright of the Flaxborough Police received the curator in his office. Purbright listened with his usual blend of courtesy and unshowy amusement, his pen poised but rarely moving. He made no immediate suggestion that the matter was criminal, nor did he permit his eyebrows to rise at the mention of Sister Isidora. "Skeletons," he observed gently when Mr. Sproul had exhausted himself, "are not ordinarily considered portable, unless, of course, one has a particular reason for wishing to carry them off. Let us begin, perhaps, by considering who might have such a reason." The curator blinked at this, then shook his head in despair. Purbright smiled faintly and reached for the telephone, with the air of a man preparing to stroll down a path whose view was presently obscured, but which promised in time to reveal something faintly absurd and quietly alarming. By the time Mrs. Thursby had taken her luncheon, 2 bath buns and a cup of milky tea at the museum's staff room table, she was already weary of having to repeat, with diminishing patience, that she had not misheard, misseen, nor indeed misinterpreted the nun's whispering. She had, after all, been a woman of unimpeachable attentiveness for 37 years. In her view, the presence of Sister Isidora before Tobias Wraxall's mortal remnants had borne all the marks of a visitation rather than a casual pause. What precisely the nun had whispered, well, that was another matter. It was enough, apparently, for Lucy Teatime to expand the detail into a declaration of conspiracy. In her version, the nun had distinctly promised Wraxall that she would set him free, words Miss Teatime delivered with the rolling solemnity of a stage actress. That she had been nowhere near the museum that day did not restrain her confidence. Indeed, her authority grew with each repetition. "One has ears everywhere," she explained with a mysterious tap to her temple. Mr. Appleyard, meanwhile, chose a more commercial approach to the gossip. Customers buying nothing more than a pencil received the confidential assurance that the police had reason to believe in a ritualistic interference. By this he meant, quite simply, that someone had spirited away the skeleton for purposes both unsavoury and obscure. He had little difficulty in implying that Roman Catholic sisters, whether cloistered or otherwise, were known for certain clandestine practices in their convent gardens. Those who raised eyebrows at this suggestion were reminded, in tones of cautionary reproach, that one never knows what goes on behind high walls. At the Hand and Racket, the town's most respectable if faintly stuffy public house, speculation reached its most animated pitch. The clientele, retired officials, small tradesmen who had achieved a sense of authority by avoiding bankruptcy, and 1 or 2 ladies with a taste for sherry, debated the skeleton's fate with all the grave relish of a vestry committee deciding the destiny of a cracked bell. Some contended that boys from the grammar school, led by that ever-inventive Baxter lad, had effected the theft in order to smuggle the bones into some school play. Others, more worldly, suggested an unscrupulous medical student had slipped back into town for the sake of replenishing his anatomy collection. But it was Miss Teatime's embroidered tale of the nun's whispered promise which prevailed, largely because it supplied both motive and mystery. Across town, Inspector Purbright allowed the murmur of such theories to wash past him without interference. He had sent Sergeant Lovejoy to the museum with the quiet instructions to note not only the absence of Tobias Wraxall, but also any other absence less immediately apparent, such as a caretaker's key or a record from the curator's logbook. Lovejoy, stout in body and rather more stout in earnestness, returned with notes written in a hand so heavy it left grooves in the paper. "No sign of forcing, sir," he reported, lowering himself into the office chair with a sigh that suggested the exertion of standing had been considerable. "The case is as it was, locks proper, glass untouched, and the caretaker, Mr. Hollin, swears blind he locked up as usual." Purbright inclined his head. "Mr. Hollin is not one to miss a lock, I take it?" "Conscientious chap," Lovejoy affirmed, though partial to a pint after hours. Purbright, whose gaze had drifted to the window where a fine mist was descending on the police yard, allowed a faint smile. Conscientiousness and conviviality are not necessarily irreconcilable. Still, perhaps you might look into where precisely Mr. Hollin takes his pint, and at what regularity. Lovejoy made a note, so determined that the pencil snapped. He apologized and reached for a spare. The inspector leaned back in his chair, fingers loosely steepled. It was not the loss of the skeleton that intrigued him. Flaxborough, he reflected, had survived greater indignities, but the timing of Sister Isidora's visit. A nun whispering to the deceased, and the deceased vanishing that very night, was a sequence altogether too neat for coincidence. Still, to pursue the matter directly would be clumsy. Purbright believed in allowing the truth to drift into view, much as mist revealed the outlines of roofs and chimneys. It was better to listen first to what was said, and more importantly, to how it was said. Accordingly, that afternoon he paid a call on the Hand and Racket, where he was received with the respectful unease reserved for policemen in uniform. Ordering nothing more suspicious than a ginger beer, he settled himself at a corner table and let the chatter circulate. He did not have long to wait. Miss Teatime, seeing in him an audience of authority, at once approached. "My dear Inspector," she began, her voice rich with satisfaction, "I suppose you have already discovered the dreadful compact made between that nun and the poor Mr. Wraxall?" Purbright's eyes twinkled behind their habitual calm. "Compact, Miss Teatime?" "Yes, indeed. I have it on sound authority that she released him from his captivity in glass." "You will not be forgotten. Those were her very words. Now what clearer declaration could there be of a plot?" Purbright inclined his head, as though considering a philosophical point. "Might it not, Miss Teatime, have been a form of prayer? Many devout persons speak thus of the departed." "Pah!" she said briskly. "A prayer that comes true overnight? Inspector, I am astonished at your innocence." At this, the company laughed, relieved to see authority gently deflected. Purbright smiled too, content to let Miss Teatime shine in her theatre of scandal. He made no note, though the phrase she quoted remained carefully stored in his mind. When he returned to the station, Lovejoy was waiting with fresh intelligence. "I found Hollins, sir. King's Arms every night without fail. Stays for 2 pints, sometimes 3. Says he locked the museum tight, but he did mention something odd. Said he'd heard a sort of knocking sound just as he was leaving." "Knocking?" Purbright repeated. From inside, he thought, but he reckoned it was pipes settling. "Pipes rarely settle with intent," the inspector murmured. He dismissed Lovejoy with a mild request for further observation of Sister Isidora's comings and goings, then sat for a long time at his desk, staring at the blotter as though it contained an unspoken statement. By evening, the town had fashioned an entire mythology around the missing bones. Some swore the skeleton had been carted away in a pram by a woman in black, others that the spirit of Tobias Wraxall himself had tired of confinement and gone walking into the river meadows. The police station received 2 telephone calls from citizens who had glimpsed spectral figures near the gasworks. Purbright recorded each with grave politeness, but neither smiled nor frowned. He was interested instead in a more modest matter, the absence of a small brass label once attached to the skeleton stand, inscribed with the words, "Presented by Mrs. Wraxall, 1897. According to Mr. Sproul, it too had vanished, a trifle perhaps. Yet trifles, Purbright knew, often spoke with greater clarity than witnesses. And so, while Flaxborough lay abed that night, full of tales and half-baked certainties, Inspector Purbright wrote in his notebook a single line, then closed it with quiet satisfaction. The next morning broke with that damp, grey obstinacy peculiar to Flaxborough weather. It was not a rain to commit itself fully, merely the sort of persistent drizzle that seemed to hang like doubt in the air and persuade citizens to change their scarves twice before leaving home. Inspector Purbright, who maintained that precipitation made people more talkative in order to justify their own discomfort, took the opportunity to begin his inquiries. He walked to the convent of St. Mildred's, a modest collection of red brick buildings whose spire had long since surrendered to ivy. The nun who received him at the gate was not Sister Isidora, but a younger woman, Sister Agnes, who regarded Purbright with the wary politeness of one accustomed to tradesmen. "The Reverend Mother is not disposed to receive visitors," she said, "unless it be a matter of the gravest importance." Purbright bowed his head slightly. "I dare say the vanishing of a gentleman's bones from the town museum may fall within that description." This earned him a frown, but the gate was opened a crack wider, and he was conducted to a small parlour smelling faintly of damp hymn-books. Presently Sister Isidora entered, her tall figure straight as a post, her eyes severe but not unkind. "Inspector," she said, her tone more statement than greeting, "I understand my name has been mentioned." Purbright folded his hands. "It has, sister. And since the mention concerned your conversation with Mr. Tobias Wraxall, whom you may have noticed is at present indisposed, I thought it best to consult you directly." Sister Isidora did not flinch. "I prayed for his soul. Surely that is not an offence, even in Flaxborough." "No offence at all," Purbright assured her. "Indeed, a commendable act. Yet you will understand that when one prays audibly before a skeleton that then disappears, tongues are apt to wag. I must therefore ask, did you notice anything unusual about the case that day?" She paused long enough to measure her reply. "Only that Mr. Wraxall seemed neglected, a benefactor of the poor, displayed like a specimen in a schoolroom. I thought it an indignity." "Neglect is often a civic habit," Purbright said gently. "But bones rarely absent themselves out of protest. You saw no one else? Heard nothing?" "No one. Nothing." Her eyes softened, though her mouth remained stern. "Inspector, I have no talent for mischief, and even less for larceny." Purbright inclined his head, accepting the statement without endorsing it. He asked no further questions, and after a few moments' silence, Sister Isidora excused herself. Walking back into town, Purbright reflected that the nun's manner was neither defensive nor guilty. Rather, it suggested a woman who considered herself answerable to a higher tribunal than the borough police. That, he thought, could be troublesome in its own way. At the station, he found Sergeant Lovejoy poring over a list of recent visitors to the museum. "Got names from the admissions book, sir," he said, tapping the paper with a sausage-like finger. "Day before last, when the nun went in, there was also a Mr. Spindler, Mrs. Thursby says. Chap from Leeds, collector of curiosities." "Spindler?" Purbright repeated mildly. "Did he leave an address?" "Guest house, Mrs. Minto's on Vicarage Row. But he checked out yesterday morning, early." Purbright's eyes lingered on the list. "Curiosities," he murmured. "One wonders whether a 19th-century philanthropist reduced to bone qualifies as such." Lovejoy looked troubled. "Would be easy, though, would it, to cart off a whole skeleton?" "Less easy, perhaps, than to detach a brass label," Purbright replied. That afternoon, Purbright paid a visit to Mrs. Minto's lodging-house. She was a stout woman of florid complexion who clearly resented police intrusion into her world of antimacassars and doilies. Yes, Mr. Spindler had stayed. A quiet gentleman, if one discounted the smell of cigar smoke and a tendency to complain about the porridge. He had settled his bill, left no forwarding address, and departed with a single suitcase, though I would swear it clanked like coal. "Did he speak of his interests?" Purbright asked. "Coins, medals, old things," Mrs. Minto replied with a sniff. "He said our museum was a disgrace, no order, no glass polish, labels all crooked. Quite put out he was." Back at the station, Purbright and Lovejoy considered these tidings. "Suspicious fellow, sir," Lovejoy declared. "Could be he's spirited away Wraxall entire." "Possible," said Purbright softly. "But a man leaving in daylight with a skeleton, clanking or otherwise, would surely have occasioned remark. We mustn't be too hasty." That evening, as dusk crept over Flaxborough, Purbright sat by his office window and watched lamps wink into life along the high street. Somewhere out there, he felt, was a perfectly ordinary explanation for an extraordinary theft. But ordinary explanations often required extraordinary patience. And patience, he reflected, was one commodity Flaxborough supplied in endless quantity. By the time Friday's Flaxborough Chronicle appeared, its editors had managed to squeeze Tobias Wraxall's absence into a 2-column spread beneath the far less sensational headline of "Local Museum Suffers Misfortune." The article did not venture into speculation. It merely noted that the exhibit had been removed by persons unknown and that the police were making inquiries. Yet by the time it was read over breakfast across the borough, every household had supplied its own missing details. The Chronicle, through no fault of its own, had reinforced what many already believed. The skeleton had been taken quite deliberately, and it was only a matter of discovering by whom. The natural convenience of a culprit had presented itself in the form of Mr. Spindler, the mysterious visitor from Leeds, that he had checked out of Mrs. Minto's lodging-house on the very morning following the disappearance seemed to all but confirm the suspicion. He was a collector. He had been overheard disparaging the museum, and, most damning of all, he was an outsider. In Flaxborough, to be an outsider was to be guilty of something, whether or not it had yet been defined. By noon that day, Mr. Spindler's name was spoken with a certainty that suggested he had already been tried, convicted, and transported. At the Hand and Racket, the gentlemen of the Snug shook their heads in sage disapproval of the man. "Professional thief, no doubt," said one, while another maintained he was a dealer supplying the black market in human remains, though what such a market might consist of was left vague. Even Sergeant Lovejoy, whose loyalty to Purbright's scepticism was usually steady, seemed persuaded. "We've got him, sir," he said with quiet triumph as he laid fresh notes on Purbright's desk. "He's known in Leeds for poking about junk shops. Mrs. Minto's sure his bag rattled like bones when he left. We just need to put the word out through West Riding Police. They'll pick him up, easy as that." Purbright listened with his characteristic stillness, tapping his pen very gently against the blotter. "Perhaps," he said, "though I am not convinced that Mr. Spindler's appetite for curiosities runs to the vertebrae of a Victorian philanthropist." "But who else, sir?" Lovejoy pressed. "The nun?" "Surely not." "Surely not," Purbright agreed mildly, though not in the tone of one wholly persuaded. "And yet, Sergeant, we must ask ourselves why Mr. Spindler would trouble himself to carry away an entire skeleton, one hardly in prime condition, when, as Mrs. Minto reported, his luggage consisted of a single suitcase. Even assuming bones are more collapsible than appearances suggest, I should think the packing would present an ungainly challenge." Lovejoy looked crestfallen, but rallied. "Unless he dismantled it, sir, bit by bit." Purbright permitted himself the faintest smile. "An anatomical jigsaw to be reconstructed in his drawing-room? It is a thought, certainly. But let us not yet indulge it beyond reason." Word of Spindler's supposed guilt reached the museum itself, where Mr. Sproul, the curator, seized upon it with palpable relief. "I said at once, Inspector, it must be the fellow from Leeds. He had the look of acquisitiveness, and his remarks about our displays positively sneering. I knew at the time it was envy." Mrs. Thursby, the attendant, nodded eagerly. "Yes, sir. One could see it in his nose, the kind of nose that twitches at valuables." Purbright, noting this curious piece of physiognomic evidence, allowed the two to expand their indignation, then brought the interview to a close with polite promises. He was not inclined to explain that human larceny was rarely betrayed by nasal twitching. In the town at large, meanwhile, Sister Isidora's name had not vanished entirely from suspicion. While she enjoyed among some the aura of piety, others considered it no coincidence that her whispered prayers had immediately preceded Wraxall's disappearance. The idea of a nun in possession of a skeleton was less absurd when clothed in mystery. Miss Teatime, for one, insisted that Sister Isidora was engaged in a ritual release, words she pronounced with evident satisfaction. "She has taken him to some convent cellar," Miss Teatime announced to a small but enthralled gathering at the Hand and Racket. "You may depend upon it, they have altars, you know, and secret lamps, and they perform ceremonies at midnight, quite improper." When asked how precisely she knew this, Miss Teatime merely raised her eyebrows. "My dear, one always knows." Inspector Purbright, seated in his office with the window cracked to admit the smell of wet cobblestones, regarded the situation with a patient amusement. It was precisely the sort of case Flaxborough enjoyed, scandalous enough to animate the town, improbable enough to preserve its gentility. Yet for him the matter remained stubbornly incomplete. If Spindler had indeed taken the skeleton, why had he done so without any trace of forced entry? And if Sister Isidora was involved, what conceivable purpose could she have in removing bones to which she had no obvious connection? The key, he felt, lay not in the suspects themselves, but in the missing brass label. It was too trivial to attract general attention, yet too deliberate to be accidental. A skeleton might be carried off with clumsiness. A label, however, must be removed with intention. Still, it was not his habit to parade his doubts before others. The town, the council, and even his own sergeant preferred their culprits neat and prompt. Purbright had long since learned that patience was more enduring than either indignation or gossip. That afternoon, however, a development arose that temporarily eclipsed such quietude. The mayor of Flaxborough, Alderman Crottle, arrived at the station in considerable agitation. His dignity, normally unassailable beneath layers of civic waistcoating, was badly shaken. "This skeleton business, Inspector, is most intolerable," he declared, seating himself without invitation. "The Chronicle is making capital of it. I have had letters from ratepayers demanding to know how we propose to keep our public institutions secure if Bones may walk away in the night. Bones, Inspector, what will visitors think?" Purbright considered the question gravely. "Perhaps, sir, they will think Flaxborough a town of unusual vitality." The alderman did not smile. "I expect swift results, Inspector. The council meets Monday, and it will not do for me to appear without some assurance. You will, I trust, have apprehended the culprit by then?" Purbright folded his hands. "We have, of course, a person of interest, a Mr. Spindler of Leeds." "Excellent!" the mayor exclaimed all at once, restored. "Then you will make the arrest?" Purbright's expression did not alter. "We are in consultation with colleagues in Leeds. Matters will proceed in their proper course." This was enough to soothe the alderman, who departed with the satisfaction of a man who would soon have a name to announce in council. Left alone, Purbright allowed his eyes to drift towards the neat pile of reports on his desk. The name Spindler might serve the town's appetite for a villain, but it did not yet satisfy his own. Something about the business remained stubbornly resistant to tidy explanation. And Inspector Purbright, who disliked untidiness less than he disliked premature neatness, resolved to continue listening for the details others dismissed as trivial. By evening, Flaxborough was certain of two things: that Mr. Spindler was guilty, and that Sister Isidora knew more than she admitted. The first certainty was loudly proclaimed, the second whispered with relish. Between the two, the skeleton of Tobias Wraxall continued to be absent, a silence more eloquent than all the town's chatter. Purbright, making his final notes of the day, summed the matter in his careful, understated hand. Public opinion, Spindler. Gossip, Sister Isidora. Evidence, neither. He closed the notebook and extinguished his lamp, content to let the town believe what it pleased for now. After all, The truth had a way of waiting for the right moment to step politely into the room. The weekend drew itself slowly across Flaxborough, a weekend marked less by leisure than by speculation. Church pews bore the weight of whispered theories that seemed to multiply between sermon and hymn, while the grocer's shop grew congested with customers who, under pretence of comparing apples, contrived to exchange rumours as if they were ration coupons. Through it all, Inspector Purbright went about his quiet rounds with no more urgency than a man contemplating a crossword clue whose answer he already half suspected. He listened, nodded, and allowed the town's imagination to do what it invariably did best, embroider the plain fabric of fact with colours never intended by the loom. It was during one such errand, a stroll along the High Street in the damp aftermath of Sunday service, that Purbright found himself hailed by Mr. Sproul, the museum curator. Sproul's face bore the solemnity of a man who has discovered a fresh calamity and wishes to be admired for the stoicism with which he bears it. "Inspector, I have made an appalling discovery," he began without so much as a good morning. "Another item is missing, small in itself but irreplaceable." Purbright allowed his eyebrows the faintest assent. "Indeed. And what item would that be?" "The label, Inspector, the brass plaque affixed to Wraxall's stand. It read, 'Presented by Mrs. Wraxall, 1897. I was polishing the remaining cases when I realized its absence, no doubt taken at the same time as the skeleton.' A souvenir, perhaps?" Purbright inclined his head, as if noting a minor household detail. "A souvenir, perhaps," he repeated. Yet the words lingered in his mind. In truth, he had already marked the label's disappearance, but hearing Sproul describe it as an afterthought only sharpened the matter. The skeleton itself might be heavy, cumbersome, even theatrical, but a label, flat, pocketable, unremarkable, required deliberate choice. Why trouble to take it, unless one had some design upon the memory of Tobias Wraxall rather than his bones? That evening, Purbright permitted himself a detour through the municipal archives, a dusty room above the library where files slumbered undisturbed for decades at a time. The caretaker unlocked it for him with visible reluctance, as though convinced that disturbing such sediment might provoke civic ghosts. Here, Purbright unearthed the records of Tobias Wraxall's bequest. A philanthropist of modest fortune, Wraxall had endowed the Poor Relief Fund with both money and moral enthusiasm, qualities that in Flaxborough rarely survived beyond their donor. The file included a faded photograph of the benefactor, stern in beard and frock coat, and a letter of presentation from his widow, bequeathing his remains to the instruction of posterity. There, too, was a note of municipal debate preserved in brittle shorthand. Some councillors had objected to the skeleton's display on grounds of dignity, while others maintained it offered a salutary lesson in mortality. The matter was resolved apparently by Mrs. Wraxall's insistence that her husband had often expressed a wish to continue his service to the town even beyond the grave. Purbright closed the file gently. If the skeleton were now missing, it seemed its service had been extended in a rather less edifying fashion. On Monday morning, Alderman Crottle's council meeting convened with a sense of impending drama. The theft had provided councillors with something infinitely preferable to potholes and drainage, an outrage safely remote from their own conduct. With relish, they demanded reports, assurances, and, above all, a culprit. Purbright, seated with calm courtesy, supplied what he could. "Our inquiries continue," he said. "We are liaising with police in Leeds regarding a visitor named Mr. Spindler." At this, heads nodded vigorously. A foreign name, a travelling bag, and a timely departure, all the ingredients required for comfortable certainty. But when Councillor Tippett demanded to know what other items had been stolen, Purbright added, with quiet precision, a brass label commemorating Mrs. Wraxall's presentation. The councillors blinked as one. The loss of a skeleton was dramatic, almost comic, but the loss of a label was perplexing, offering none of the glamour of scandal. Crottle coughed and waved the detail aside. Purbright, however, did not. As he walked back through the drizzle to the station, he reflected that the theft of bones might delight the town's appetite for melodrama, but the theft of memory, such as a small plaque, bore, suggested motive. A skeleton was impersonal, a curiosity. A label, by contrast, carried names, and names in Flaxborough always mattered. That afternoon he summoned Sergeant Lovejoy. "I should like," he said, "to know whether Mrs. Wraxall's descendants remain in the town. It would be useful to learn whether any of them still feel keenly about their ancestors' reputation." Lovejoy, delighted to have a task that sounded substantial, set about it with clumsy enthusiasm. By tea-time he had produced a list of two, a distant great-niece, Mrs. Henrietta Quarles, who kept a boarding-house on the East Road, and a grandson once removed, Mr. Lionel Wraxall, solicitor, whose office bore an impressive brass plate of its own near the market-place. Purbright chose the solicitor first. Lionel Wraxall was a thin man, taut as if pulled by invisible strings, with a face that gave the impression of having been carved for disapproval. He received Purbright in his office with frosty civility. "My grandfather's skeleton has always been a source of embarrassment," he said, before the inspector had spoken more than a greeting. "A vulgar display, quite unworthy of the family. My late mother frequently petitioned for its removal. Unfortunately, the council was obstinate." "And yet," Purbright observed mildly, "the skeleton endured until last week." "Indeed. And now at last perhaps the family's dignity will be restored. I cannot say I regret the loss." "Nor," Purbright said gently. "Can you explain it?" Lionel's lips tightened. "I am a solicitor, Inspector, not a thief." It was, Purbright thought as he took his leave, not the most robust of alibis. Next he called upon Mrs. Henrietta Quarles, whose boarding-house smelled strongly of cabbage and harboured an alarming number of cats. Unlike her cousin, Mrs. Quarles treated the matter as both comic and tragic. "Oh, Tobias," she exclaimed, "such a stiff old bore in life, and now a stiffer one in death, though I must say I miss the label more than the bones. At least the label had his name spelt correctly. Wraxall with 2 L's. People are forever making it one." Purbright nodded gravely. "And do you think it possible someone took the label for that reason?" She pursed her lips. "Possible, yes. Likely, no. People don't go about stealing for spelling's sake, not unless they're very odd." Odd or not, Purbright thought, it remained the single detail he could not discard. A skeleton might be borne away for amusement, for protest, for black market traffic, any number of implausible but thinkable reasons. A label, however, had value only to one who cared about names and therefore about reputation. That night, as Flaxborough resumed its chatter over supper tables and public house counters, Inspector Purbright sat at his desk and considered the curious fact that Tobias Wraxall had been publicly dishonoured not once but twice, first by being exhibited like a specimen, and now by being removed altogether. In the inspector's quiet mind, the theft had ceased to be a prank or a burglary. It had become a gesture, a statement, small yet deliberate, made in brass more than in bone. And though the town still clamoured for Mr. Spindler's arrest, Purbright wrote a single sentence in his notebook before extinguishing his lamp. "The skeleton is a smokescreen, the label is the crime." The town of Flaxborough had, by Tuesday morning, reached that stage in its communal excitement when speculation began to consume itself. The wilder theories, the skeleton having been spirited away by medical students or requisitioned for sinister rites in a ruined chapel, were already being dismissed, not because they lacked colour, but because they had grown stale. In Flaxborough, Novelty was essential to rumour. Repetition dulled the flavour. The newest invention was that the skeleton had been stolen for export. There was, according to Mrs. Maycock of Station Road, a thriving trade in genuine English bones across the Atlantic, where dentists paid handsomely to acquire them for demonstrations. Nobody asked how Mrs. Maycock came by this intelligence, but she retold it often enough to earn herself a brief, smug celebrity. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, allowed the town to chatter itself into exhaustion. He had long discovered that people revealed more once they believed their news had lost its power. A man who repeats a rumour with bored reluctance is more likely to betray, in a careless aside, the thread of truth tangled within it. It was Sergeant Lovejoy who supplied the next practical piece of information. Standing in the inspector's office with a sheaf of notes held at arm's length, as if fearing infection, he reported, "I've asked round the carriers and delivery people, sir. None of them has seen anything that looked like a skeleton being moved, but one chap, Mr. Fulliger, from the brewery dray, says he did spot a fellow carrying a flat parcel late on Friday evening. Brass-coloured, he thought, near the municipal park." Purbright's interest quickened, though his face scarcely altered. "Flat and brass-coloured, you say?" did he remark on size. "About so," said Lovejoy, indicating with his hands something no bigger than a book. The inspector's mind tightened its circle. A brass label might well fit such a description. But what connection had the park to Wraxall's memory? He decided to walk there himself, not because he expected to find the label tossed carelessly among the shrubs, but because Flaxborough's parks, like its pubs, were reservoirs of overheard remark. And so that afternoon he wandered beneath the dripping elms with the leisurely air of a man seeking respite rather than evidence. It was there he encountered Miss Lucy Teetle, spinster, retired milliner, and self-appointed custodian of municipal morals. She advanced upon him with the brisk determination of one who knows she is about to say something the police have overlooked. "Inspector," she began, "I do not wish to cause alarm, but I have observed a most curious nocturnal activity." "Indeed?" Purbright inclined his head, resigned yet attentive. "Friday evening, about 10:30, I was closing my shutters when I observed a light, a lantern, Inspector, not an electric torch, passing through the trees of the park, and I distinctly heard voices, low but urgent, as if conspiring. When I rose early the next morning to inspect, I noticed the grass disturbed near the Wraxall memorial bench. You were aware of the bench?" Purbright was aware. It had been placed there some years after Tobias Wraxall's death, inscribed with the somewhat smug motto, "Virtue is its own reward." Miss Teetle drew herself upright. "If you ask me, Inspector, there is devilry afoot, lanterns, conspiracies, and midnight vigils. It smacks of ritual." "Possibly," Purbright murmured, "though one might equally suspect gardening." She sniffed unconvinced and stalked away. The inspector, left to himself, wandered to the bench. He did indeed observe faint scarring in the turf, as though someone had scraped or dug with little care. Nothing remained, however, save a smear of damp earth upon the plaque. Yet in that smear he discerned something more significant than Miss Teetle's devilry. A trace of polish, brassy and greenish, rubbed across the lettering as though the hand that pressed it down had recently handled metal. That evening he called again upon Lionel Wraxall, the solicitor. The man's office smelt of dust and disinfectant, and Lionel himself appeared impatient at the intrusion. "Inspector, I have clients awaiting." Purbright nodded sympathetically. "I shall be brief. I have reason to think the brass label removed from your grandfather's skeleton has lately been in this town. Very lately." Lionel stiffened. "I fail to see why you trouble me with this. If anything, its disappearance is a relief." "Relief, yes," Purbright said softly. though one wonders, Mr. Wraxall, whether relief alone is sufficient motive to wander a park at night with a lantern. The solicitor's mouth fell open a fraction before he mastered it. "Are you suggesting—" "I suggest nothing," Purbright replied with courteous finality. "I merely inquire." He left Lionel in a state of rigid indignation that to the inspector's seasoned eye betrayed more disquiet than innocence. Back at the station, Lovejoy was eager with a new discovery. "Sir, I checked with Mrs. Quarles again, the boarding-house lady. She said her cousin Lionel hasn't been on speaking terms with her for months. Something about the family property. She hinted there was a quarrel over who had the right to display Mr. Wraxall's legacy." Purbright leaned back, allowing the chair to creak. "And that legacy, Sergeant, included not only money, but, rather more awkwardly, bones." The sergeant's eyes widened. "So you think it's a family feud, sir? Like them Greek plays?" "Something of the sort," Purbright replied dryly. "Only less heroic and with more cabbage." Over the next days he moved quietly, asking questions not so much about Tobias Wraxall as about his descendants. He discovered that Lionel had long resented the town's ownership of the skeleton, believing it demeaned the family's professional standing. Mrs. Quarles, by contrast, had often paraded her connection as a minor celebrity, taking a perverse pride in her skeletonized forebear. The theft, therefore, offered two possibilities: Lionel seeking to erase a shame, or Henrietta seeking to dramatize a connection. But only Lionel possessed both the fastidious contempt and the access to polished brass. Yet still, Purbright knew, a missing label was not evidence. He must wait, with his customary patience, for the vanity of others to loosen the knot. That chance arrived one evening when Miss Lucy Teetle again intercepted him in the High Street. "Inspector," she hissed, with conspiratorial urgency, "I have been vindicated. I saw Mr. Lionel Wraxall himself in the park again last night, carrying what looked suspiciously like a spade." Purbright listened, thanked her gravely, and continued on his way. He had no intention of allowing Miss Teetle to become his chief witness. The woman's appetite for melodrama made her unreliable. But her report confirmed that Lionel, solicitor though he was, had taken to nocturnal excursions armed with gardening implements. Later that week, Purbright arranged an unobtrusive patrol of the park. Constable Thackeray, concealed with less grace than intended behind a lilac bush, observed Lionel, indeed, pacing near the Wraxall bench, lantern in one hand, spade in the other. He seemed to be searching for something he had mislaid. When questioned discreetly the following morning, Lionel explained with a brittle smile that he was merely attending to family business and refused further comment. Purbright did not press. Instead, he filed the matter quietly, certain now that Lionel Wraxall's obsession with his grandfather's memory ran deeper than a wish for dignity. The brass label had not been taken for profit or for prank. It had been taken as part of a ritual act of erasure or perhaps repossession. The skeleton, still absent, remained the louder mystery. But in Purbright's mind the true story had narrowed itself to one man, a lantern, and a name engraved in brass. And as Flaxborough busied itself with ever more elaborate fantasies of foreign collectors and black-market anatomists, the inspector sat patient, watchful, knowing the next movement would come not from strangers, but from the town's own proud and quarrelsome lineage. The following morning, Purbright found his office adorned, with the comforting sight of 2 files, 3 unopened letters, and Sergeant Lovejoy peering mournfully into a cup of tea that had clearly died several hours earlier. "Something amiss, Sergeant?" Lovejoy lifted the cup as if showing a corpse. "Milk's turned, tastes like plaster." "Then abandon it," said Purbright. "It is the fate of most things to sour. The sergeant gave a grunt of philosophic agreement and brightened at the chance to pass on fresh information. "I've been to see the caretaker at the old municipal records office. He says Lionel Wraxall's been in there more than once this past fortnight, asking after deeds and archives about his grandfather. Wanted to see if there were any official notes about what became of Tobias's effects after his death." Purbright raised his brows. "The solicitor inquires into his own family papers through a janitor? Curious economy of effort." "Exactly, sir." "The caretaker thought it strange too, said Mr. Wraxall didn't want anything noted down, just wanted to look at things in private." The inspector leaned back. His thoughts arranged themselves with a quiet inevitability. Lionel hunting documents, Lionel prowling with lantern and spade, Lionel scouring the park for something either lost or deliberately hidden. It was less the skeleton itself now than its symbolic trappings that seemed to agitate him. By late afternoon, Purbright's steps carried him once more to the boarding house of Mrs. Henrietta Quarles. She received him with the moist-eyed eagerness of one who believes tragedy has finally given her a starring role. "Oh, Inspector, I have been expecting you," she exclaimed, ushering him into a parlour heavy with antimacassars and the scent of boiled ham. "You must be positively at your wits' end with this terrible mystery. My cousin Lionel has always been peculiar, you know. He cannot abide the thought that our dear ancestor should be anything less than reverently remembered. I, on the other hand, feel it is a civic duty to share Tobias with the public. After all, what use are skeletons if kept in cupboards?" "Indeed," Purbright murmured, eyeing the teacups with suspicion. She leaned forward, lowering her voice to a dramatic whisper. "You may not be aware, Inspector, but there was once a clause in the Wraxall will concerning burial. Some say Tobias wished his remains interred properly after a time. If that clause has been found by Lionel, it might explain everything. He has always been so terribly literal." "Literal, perhaps," Purbright said, "though not, I think, sufficiently courageous to admit it. Henrietta, delighted by what she took to be a confidential disclosure, clutched her bosom with theatrical gravity. "So you believe Lionel guilty? How thrilling! I must prepare myself to testify. Do you suppose the BBC would take an interest?" The inspector excused himself gently before her imagination could expand to camera angles. That evening he strolled back towards the station, reflecting. A clause in the will, or at least the belief in such a clause, might explain Lionel's furtive movements. If Tobias had written that his bones should eventually be laid to rest, Lionel could regard the town's display of them as a continuing desecration. Yet the law, so many years later, would hardly honour so whimsical a bequest. Still, in families, law was often less powerful than sentiment. At the station, Lovejoy was waiting with another scrap of news. "Sir, there's been some whispering at the pub. Lionel's been asking around about workmen who might do a job after dark, quiet-like. Nobody's taken him up, but it's got folks talking." "After dark?" "Yes, sir. Digging, they reckon. Something to do with the cemetery, perhaps." Purbright's eyes narrowed slightly. A solicitor sneaking about the cemetery at night was too neat a picture to accept without verification. But he did not discount it either. 2 nights later, his suspicions were tested. Constable Thackeray, who possessed the patience of a half-trained retriever, returned from his park watch with an unusual report. "Saw Mr. Wraxall again, sir, only this time he weren't digging, he was putting something back. Looked like a bundle wrapped in cloth. He laid it under the bench, then went away. When I went to look—" Thackeray paused, uneasy. "It was gone." "Gone?" "Gone, sir. Vanished before I reached it. Must have been someone else watching too, who snatched it quick." Purbright felt a small thrill, the rare stirring that comes when an untidy puzzle produces a new edge. There were more players here than Lionel alone. Someone had anticipated him. The following day, the inspector visited Lionel directly, dispensing with courtesy. He found him in chambers, twitching over a pile of deeds. "Mr. Wraxall," Purbright said, "it would be less inconvenient for you if you told me at once what you placed beneath that bench last night." Lionel paled. "You spied!" "Inspector, this is intolerable. I am a solicitor." "Yes," Purbright replied, "and a solicitor who traffics in nocturnal packages." Lionel struggled visibly between indignation and collapse. Finally he muttered, "It was nothing but some private papers. I feared they might be stolen if kept here. I thought the bench a safer place, temporarily." "A municipal park bench safer than a solicitor's safe?" Purbright asked very softly. "You must forgive me, Mr. Wraxall, if I find your faith in Flaxborough's public seating somewhat eccentric." Lionel, floundering, could produce no answer. Later, in conversation with Sergeant Lovejoy, Purbright admitted, "He's lying, of course, but clumsily. The question is, what did he hide that another was waiting to steal? That other, I fancy, may be the key." The sergeant, warming to the drama, asked, "Do you think it could have been the brass label, sir?" "Possibly, though I suspect it was something written. Something that might prove why the label mattered." The inspector now set about his quietest work, listening. He lingered in the pubs, walked with ostensible idleness through the marketplace, and let Flaxborough's gossipers fill his ears. Piece by piece a pattern emerged, not of Lionel alone, but of an older story, barely remembered, concerning Tobias Wraxall himself. A story of a scandal hushed, of a professional error that had left a patient dead, and of rumours that Tobias, stung by disgrace, had ordered some eccentric provision in his will to preserve his reputation. Purbright did not yet know whether that provision demanded eternal display or solemn burial. But he knew Lionel believed in it passionately, and that someone else believed enough to intercept his secret bundle. By the end of that week, Purbright's gaze returned to the one element that had been consistently overlooked, the nun, the quiet sister from the convent school who, at the very start, had stumbled upon the empty cabinet and whispered that chilling word, skeleton. She had vanished since, retreating into cloistered life, yet her presence hovered like an echo. It was time, Purbright decided, to visit the convent. Skeletons and Wraxalls might belong to family pride, but whispers, those belonged perhaps to nuns. The convent of St. Mildred's, a squat Georgian pile on the edge of Flaxborough, presented itself to Inspector Purbright in the pale hush of early evening. Its high brick wall, softened here and there by ivy, betrayed nothing of the women within. The bell tower, square and functional rather than decorative, tolled the hour with a humility that seemed designed to rebuke worldly curiosity. Purbright paused at the iron gate. He disliked interrogating nuns. They had the disconcerting habit of treating his questions not as intrusions, but as confessions. Still the trail had narrowed. The nun who had first discovered the empty cabinet must surely know more than she had admitted. A young sister admitted him. She looked startled to see a policeman, but bowed politely and led him through dim corridors that smelled of soap, beeswax, and faintly of chalk. Finally he was ushered into a plain parlour where Sister Agnes, the same who had stumbled, pale and stammering, into notoriety weeks ago, sat waiting. She rose at his entrance, her hands tightly folded. Her habit was neat to the point of severity, yet her face betrayed nervous colour. "Inspector," she said softly, "the Reverend Mother believed it best that I speak with you again." Purbright inclined his head. "I appreciate her wisdom." He took a chair opposite, setting his hat gently on the floor. "When we last spoke, sister, you told me only that you had discovered the cabinet empty." Might I ask you to recall that morning in detail? The nun's gaze flickered upward, as though searching for approval from a ceiling plastered long ago. I was preparing a classroom, Inspector. The children sometimes ask to see the skeleton for their lessons in anatomy. I went to fetch it, but when I drew the curtain, there was only the chair and a faint mark on the floor where the stand had stood. No sign of forced entry. She shook her head. The door was locked, yet I had a key. Others also, I believe. The Reverend Mother, and perhaps Mr. Wraxall. Purbright felt the weight of the answer settle with the inevitability of rain. Lionel Wraxall, you mean? He had access? Yes. He had visited some months before, asking permission to view the relic. He called it that, relic. He seemed strangely moved by it. Did he touch it? Her lips tightened. I believe so. He laid his hand upon the skull very tenderly, as though it were not bone, but memory. Purbright studied her face. And afterwards? Did he return? Twice, always with some explanation about research for family records. The Reverend Mother permitted it, believing him respectable. But I was uneasy. There was one night, Inspector, when I heard a sound in the corridor, a door clicking softly. I rose, but when I looked, the cabinet still seemed locked. I thought I must have dreamed it. The inspector allowed a pause to draw the words into shape. And you told no one? I feared it was uncharitable suspicion, Sister Agnes whispered. We are taught to guard against that sin. Purbright felt a wry smile tugging at his lips. In policing, sister, suspicion is our principal virtue. He leaned forward. One more matter. When you first saw the cabinet empty, why did you not cry out empty or gone? You whispered the word skeleton. It was remarked upon. The nun's eyes widened. A flush crept over her cheeks. Because I believed it still there, not in the wooden brass, but in presence. The room felt heavy, Inspector, as though that man was still seated. Only later, when I touched the stand, did I believe it removed. For the first time, Purbright felt an odd chill. Nuns, he reminded himself, lived in atmospheres thickened with centuries of devotions, whispers, and half-imagined visions. Yet her impression bore curious harmony with the mystery's tenor. The skeleton's absence was more eloquent than its display. He thanked her gravely and took his leave. Outside, twilight had slipped fully into night. The convent's bell tolled Compline as he walked away, and it seemed to him less a prayer than a warning. At the station, Sergeant Lovejoy awaited him with fresh agitation. Sir, you'll never guess. The cemetery keeper swears he saw a figure by Tobias Wraxall's grave last night. A woman in dark clothes moving quickly. When he called out, she ran, dropped something, a scrap of cloth. Looked like a nun's veil. Purbright hung his hat and sank into the chair with a sigh. Then our cloistered friends are not so immobile as they appear. Lovejoy frowned. Do you think Sister Agnes took the skeleton herself? The inspector hesitated. Not alone, no. She strikes me as timid to the point of paralysis, but it may be that someone has persuaded her of a holy errand. She feels pity for Lionel, perhaps, or reverence for Tobias. In either case, the convent is more tangled in this than it wishes to admit. That same evening, Purbright paid another visit to Lionel Wraxall, whose pallor had deepened into something cadaverous. Papers lay strewn across his desk. An empty glass stood among them like an abandoned witness. Mr. Wraxall, Purbright began, did you lately solicit help from a woman in religious garb? Lionel's head jerked up. What? A nun, Mr. Wraxall, seen at your ancestor's grave. Was it Sister Agnes? The solicitor's composure collapsed like wet tissue. He covered his face with thin fingers. I never asked her. She came of her own accord. said she understood my torment, that Tobias deserved dignity. She promised to aid me. I swear I did not coerce her." Purbright's voice was cool. "And the skeleton?" Lionel's eyes glistened. "I only wanted him buried, Inspector. Quietly, with honour. I thought if I removed him, no one would contest once he was in the earth. The papers I left beneath that bench, they proved his will, the clause he wrote. But someone stole them. Without that I have nothing. Only the bones." There it was, at last. The missing centrepiece. Tobias Wraxall had indeed ordered that his remains be granted eventual burial. Lionel, guilty not of desecration, but of belated obedience, had conspired to carry out the wish, and yet someone else had interfered, stealing the papers, shadowing his movements, possibly even the skeleton itself. Purbright left him with a warning not to stir abroad at night. As he walked back through the town, lamps gleaming like sullen eyes, he felt the narrative tighten. It was no longer about whether Tobias had been moved, but who sought to control his legacy and why. For somewhere in Flaxborough, a skeleton no longer merely exhibited, no longer safely behind brass and glass, was being shifted like contraband. And Purbright suspected the next appearance would not be quiet at all. The Saturday market in Flaxborough had, for centuries, supplied the town with potatoes, gossip, and faintly bruised apples. That morning, however, it supplied Inspector Purbright with something far less edible. The crowd had gathered, thick and murmurous, around a cart belonging to a poulterer. But it was not fowl that caused the commotion. Upon the cart, arranged in a grotesque parody of display, lay the skeleton of Tobias Wraxall. The skull, tipped at a jaunty angle by some grim hand, regarded the onlookers with what seemed sly amusement. A paper tag dangled from its rib cage. Purbright and Sergeant Lovejoy pushed through the throng, eliciting gasps of relief and curiosity. The inspector plucked the tag free, turning it over with a slow gravity. On one side was a neat line of writing. "Tobias will not be silenced. He still demands his due." On the reverse, an initial. A. The inspector folded it carefully into his pocket. Around him, townsfolk whispered and craned. Some children laughed nervously before being dragged away by scandalized mothers. The poulterer, close to apoplexy, insisted that he had found the skeleton dumped upon his cart not 10 minutes before. Purbright ordered the remains removed to the mortuary. But as he gave his instructions, he could not ignore the look upon Lionel Wraxall's face. The solicitor had appeared among the crowd, drawn by the disturbance. His eyes, upon seeing the bones, filled not with horror, but with a strange, grateful fervour, as though Tobias himself had deigned to walk the market. Later, in the quiet of his office, Purbright contemplated the letter tag. "A," he murmured. "Anonymous, accusation, or perhaps Agnes." Lovejoy looked up. "The nun?" "Yes. Though one must be careful. Sister Agnes may be impressionable, but I doubt she could haul a skeleton through town at dawn without attracting notice. There may be another hand at work, one versed in theatre. Someone trying to humiliate Lionel? Or to exalt him," Purbright replied. "Consider, the message asserts Tobias demands his due. That suits Lionel's narrative precisely. Yet Lionel swears he did not arrange it. If he is truthful, someone else wishes the Wraxall cause pursued, but with greater drama." That afternoon, Purbright visited the convent once more. The Reverend Mother received him with a serenity that bordered upon annoyance. "You must understand, Inspector," she said. "Our sisters are not in the habit of scattering bones about market stalls." "I do not accuse them collectively," Purbright assured. "But Sister Agnes has admitted to unusual sympathies with Mr. Wraxall. And there is the matter of a veil found at his grave." The Reverend Mother's lips pressed thin. Sister Agnes is fervent but guileless. If she wandered near that grave, it was in prayer, not conspiracy. I shall, however, permit you to speak with her again." Agnes, when summoned, appeared pale but calm. She denied knowledge of the market spectacle. "I heard of it only when one of the sisters returned from errands," she said. "But, Inspector, does it not strike you as a sign? Perhaps Tobias himself wills that his bones not be hidden." Purbright suppressed a sigh. "Madam, bones have no will, though men attach many to them. If Tobias desires burial, it will be by the lawful processes, not street theatre." Her eyes fell. "Then you do not believe in signs?" "I believe," he said gently, "in consequences." When he left the convent, he felt no closer to clarity. Agnes might be innocent, or she might have been persuaded to lend her habit as disguise to another. That initial A could be hers, or equally some clever mimicry. 2 evenings later, Purbright was roused from supper by a constable with urgent news. The skeleton had again vanished, this time from the mortuary itself. A sheet had been thrown across the window to conceal entry, and the bones were gone, stand and all. "Blast!" murmured Purbright. "Our thief is tireless." By dawn the skeleton had reappeared once more. This time it stood upright in the churchyard of St. Saviour's, arranged in mock pulpit stance, a hymn book propped absurdly against its hand. Another tag fluttered from its collarbone. "Preach, Tobias, until they hear." Initialed again. A, the vicar, pale and trembling, insisted upon immediate removal. Parishioners lingered in uneasy clusters as though expecting the bones to continue their sermon unaided. Back at the station, Purbright set the 2 tags side by side. The handwriting was the same, measured, elegant, oddly old-fashioned. Not Agnes's, he was fairly sure. She wrote with nervous irregularity, as he had seen when she signed her earlier statement. Lovejoy muttered, "Whoever it is, sir, they're making us look fools." Purbright rubbed his temple. "Not fools, Sergeant. Witnesses. Someone wants Tobias's case performed in public view. Each placement is more theatrical than the last. We must ask, who thrives on such spectacle?" The answer suggested itself uncomfortably. Lionel Wraxall, though he denied involvement, seemed transported by each appearance, as though vindicated. Yet to orchestrate such acts would require both daring and secrecy, qualities Lionel did not seem to possess in his frailty. Unless, of course, he had help. That night, Purbright visited Lionel again. The solicitor, slumped in his chair, greeted him with eyes bright from sleeplessness. "Inspector," he whispered, "you saw him in the churchyard, did you not? Tobias speaks through these acts. He cannot be denied." Purbright studied him. "Did you place him there?" "No, I wish I had. Whoever does so is his true disciple." Lionel's voice shook with awe. "But I thank them. I bless them. They will ensure Tobias is not forgotten." Purbright's patience thinned. "Then perhaps you will bless me also, Mr. Wraxall, when I discover that the so-called disciple may not seek Tobias's dignity at all, but your ruin. Consider, each public outrage draws attention not only to Tobias, but to you. Your family name becomes spectacle. Does that not concern you?" Lionel gave a weary laugh. "Concern? If infamy is the price, I accept it. Better infamy than silence." Purbright left him with unease, pressing heavily against his chest. The solicitor had crossed the line between grief and mania. Whether complicit or merely enraptured, he was no longer reliable. As the inspector walked home, the town square echoed faintly with Saturday's laughter and gossip, but for him, each echo seemed threaded with the dry rattle of bones. Whoever carried Tobias Wraxall from cart to pulpit was not finished. In fish, performance had only begun, and Purbright feared the next act would be staged on a grander platform still. On Monday morning, the council chamber of Flaxborough Town Hall was packed to the rafters. Civic pomp had always attracted curiosity, but never so much as on this particular day. The agenda was routine: sanitation budgets, allotment disputes, but every chair in the public gallery was filled. For rumour had preceded the meeting. Tobias Wraxall would make an appearance. No one could say how the rumour had spread, yet it swelled like smoke, irresistible and vague. Some swore a note had been nailed to the church doors, others that a whisper passed through the market on Sunday. Whatever the truth, townsfolk pressed eagerly to witness what they half believed might occur. Inspector Purbright, seated discreetly near the back, felt the tension like a wire in the air. He had brought Sergeant Lovejoy and 2 constables, positioned inconspicuously. If the skeleton did appear again, this time the culprit would not slip away unseen. The meeting commenced. Councillor Persimmons droned about drains. The mayor, perspiring freely, shuffled papers. The town clerk took notes with excessive industry. For half an hour nothing occurred save tedium. People in the gallery fidgeted. Then, as Councillor Boldin rose to deliver a passionate speech on refuse collection, a murmur swept the chamber. The double doors at the rear creaked open, and there, borne upright upon a stand, wheeled like an honoured dignitary, entered Tobias Wraxall's skeleton. A hat had been rakishly perched upon the skull. A sash of faded velvet crossed its ribs. Another of those paper tags dangled from the sternum. Tobias attends. Tobias listens. Tobias will not rest. Again initialed A. The effect was electric. Gasps, nervous laughter, shrieks from the gallery. Councillor Boldin stopped mid-sentence, mouth agape. The mayor clutched at his chain of office as though for moral support. Purbright was on his feet instantly. "Sergeant!" Lovejoy and the constables sprang forward, intercepting the macabre procession. But the skeleton had not entered of its own accord. Behind the wheeled stand, masked by the figure, darted a slim, cloaked form. Seeing the police advance, the figure bolted sideways and made for the side door. "After them!" Purbright commanded. Lovejoy gave chase, his heavy steps echoing. The figure, nimble as a cat, fled through the corridor and into the service stair. Purbright followed, heart pounding. He caught a fleeting glimpse of black cloth, a hand gloved in grey, the swing of a satchel. They burst out into the rear yard of the town hall. The fugitive leapt a stack of crates, staggered, and almost fell. For an instant the hood slipped, revealing not Sister Agnes, as Purbright half expected, but a man's sharp profile, lean and theatrical, with a dark moustache. Then he wrenched the hood back into place and vanished down an alley. Lovejoy, winded, slowed. "Lost him, sir, spry devil." Purbright drew a steadying breath. "Yes, but now we know our disciple is no nun, a man and agile, a man with a taste for performance." Back in the council chamber, chaos had reigned. Some members demanded adjournment, others insisted upon order. The skeleton, now firmly in constabulary custody, stood mute yet commanding at the centre of debate. Journalists scribbled furiously. A photographer snapped pictures despite protests. By the time calm was restored, Purbright had secured the skeleton once more in the mortuary, this time under guard. But unease remained. Whoever had engineered these theatrics had dared to invade the very seat of local government. The audacity bespoke not madness, but calculated showmanship. That evening, Purbright reviewed what he knew. The tags, each initialed A, the elegant handwriting, the obsession with public display, a man with stage flair, nimbleness, and knowledge of the town's institutions. It pointed, increasingly, to one particular figure in Flaxborough, Aubrey Chitterwick. Chitterwick was an amateur dramatist of minor repute, notorious for his flamboyant productions, at the Corn Exchange Theatre. He had, on more than one occasion, staged historical pageants involving skeletons borrowed, with dubious permission, from medical suppliers, and he was known for his grandiose conviction that art should unsettle society into truth. Purbright visited him the next morning. Chitterwick received the inspector in a parlour cluttered with velvet drapes and masks. He wore a smoking jacket and affected languor. "Inspector," he drawled, "to what do I owe the honour?" Purbright studied him coolly. "A skeleton has been making appearances about town. The market, a churchyard, now the council chamber, each time with theatrical flourish. You, Mr. Chitterwick, are perhaps the only man in Flaxborough equipped to manage such productions." Chitterwick laughed lightly, twirling his moustache. "Ah, but would I risk jail for art?" "You flatter me, sir." "I am tempted, yes, but I lack the courage. Besides, I have rehearsals every evening. One cannot simultaneously conduct skeleton escapades and direct Hamlet." "Rehearsals," said Purbright, "provide excellent alibis, especially if one's company is in thrall." Chitterwick spread his hands. "Then question them. They will swear I was present. Perhaps too loudly, but swear they will." Purbright left, unsatisfied. Chitterwick's denial rang too carefully, yet proof eluded him. That night, the matter escalated again. The town hall steps, scene of countless official proclamations, were discovered at dawn to host a final indignity. The skeleton, draped in municipal banners, stood as if addressing the populace, a scroll clutched in bony hand. The scroll contained yet another message: justice for Tobias. Justice denied is justice delayed. Flaxborough must answer. Signed, as always, A. This time Purbright arrived not to retrieve, but to watch. He observed the crowd's reaction, no longer horrified, but strangely entertained. Some applauded, as though the performance had become civic theatre. Children begged their parents to let them see Tobias again. What had begun as desecration was turning into spectacle, almost pageant. And that, Purbright realized grimly, was precisely the culprit's aim: to transform Tobias Wraxall's memory into a drama the whole town could not ignore. Later, in private conference with Lovejoy, he spoke heavily. "We are not merely chasing bones, Sergeant. We are chasing influence. The hand behind this means to sway public opinion, to force Tobias's cause into light. If they succeed, truth will drown in theatre." Lovejoy frowned. "What do we do, sir?" "We set a stage of our own," Purbright replied, "and we invite our dramatist to take centre." Inspector Purbright was not by nature theatrical, yet he understood the value of theatre in exposing those who wielded it as weapon. By Tuesday afternoon he had secured the mayor's uneasy consent for a most unusual experiment: a public reinterment of Tobias Wraxall's bones, announced with full civic solemnity. The plan was simple in outline, risky in execution. A burial service, complete with processional dignity, would be held in Flaxborough Cemetery 3 nights hence. Posters were discreetly circulated, hinting that the skeleton's wanderings had reached their end, and that Tobias was finally to be laid to lasting rest. Purbright judged that no dramatist of the culprit's persuasion could resist one final opportunity to intervene. Lovejoy, when the scheme was explained, wore the expression of a man asked to juggle scorpions. "Supposing, sir, he, or whoever it is, decides to make mischief right under our noses." "That," Purbright replied, "is precisely what we are counting on. He has flourished in surprise. Let us see how he manages when the surprise is ours." The days that followed were heavy with anticipation. Town gossip reached fever pitch. Some citizens predicted lightning bolts, others expected Tobias's bones to dissolve into dust mid-service. Children rehearsed chants of "Tobias speaks," as though for a pantomime. The clergy frowned but did not forbid. They sensed opportunity for full pews. Thursday evening arrived cold and clear. The cemetery lamps cast pale islands of light along the gravel paths. A good 100 townsfolk gathered behind the cordon, their breath misting in the night air. At the graveside, an open casket had been prepared, containing not Wraxall's remains but a carefully fashioned replica of plaster and wood, decoy bones that could withstand rough handling without sacrilege. The real skeleton remained under guard in the mortuary. The mayor, looking as though he would rather be elsewhere, stood beside the Reverend Pounceby, who recited prayers with more flourish than usual. Constables mingled with the crowd in plain clothes, eyes sharp for any disturbance. Purbright and Lovejoy stood near the front, watchful. The inspector had instructed his men if the culprit tried to disrupt proceedings, he was to be drawn inward, not chased outward. The cemetery was ringed with officers. Escape would be difficult. The service commenced. Pounceby intoned solemnly. The mayor muttered responses. The crowd shifted, half respectful, half expectant. A violinist, engaged by Chitterwick's theatre troupe at the mayor's suggestion, struck up a mournful air. Purbright suspected the dramatist himself might not resist observing the spectacle. And then it happened. As the coffin was lowered, a sudden flare of light burst above the crowd. A magnesium torch hissed and smoked, momentarily blinding all. From the haze, a voice rang out, rich, theatrical, commanding, "Do not bury Tobias. He will not be silenced." The crowd gasped. Figures stumbled, and upon the plinth by the yew tree appeared a cloaked figure, arms raised dramatically. The hood fell back to reveal the unmistakable moustache and dark eyes of Aubrey Chitterwick. In one hand he flourished a scroll, in the other a length of cord attached to a pulley rig by which he attempted to hoist a second skeleton aloft, another prop, borrowed or constructed, dangling grotesquely over the mourners. The effect was indeed theatrical, but his timing misjudged, for even as the crowd shrieked and surged, Purbright's men closed in. Lovejoy himself charged through the haze, grappling Chitterwick by the arm. The dramatist twisted, declaiming lines from Hamlet, "Alas, poor Yorick," before being firmly wrestled to the ground. Applause broke out from one corner, boos from another. It was half riot, half performance. But the constabulary prevailed. Within minutes, Chitterwick, spluttering with injured dignity, was escorted under heavy guard from the cemetery. Back at the station, he was ushered into the interview room. Purbright, composed, removed his hat and regarded him steadily across the table. "You have entertained us sufficiently, Mr. Chitterwick. Now perhaps you will explain your purpose in disturbing the peace with bones and banners." Chitterwick sat upright, dust still on his cloak, eyes glittering with feverish pride. "Purpose? Art is purpose enough. Flaxborough wallows in indifference. I have shaken it awake. Tobias Wraxall, poor Tobias, was forgotten. I gave him voice." "You gave him ridicule," Purbright said evenly. "A dead man used as stage dressing. That is not voice, but ventriloquism." The dramatist smiled faintly. "Yet you listened. They all listened. Tobias lives again in memory, does he not? That is my triumph." Purbright leaned forward. "Did Tobias confide his grievances to you? Did you know him personally?" The smile faltered. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in Chitterwick's eyes. "We crossed paths. He admired my productions. He said art was truth. I believed him. Wronged by this town, buried in its bureaucracy, his fate was silence. I chose to answer." "By grave robbing?" Purbright's tone sharpened. Chitterwick hesitated, then shrugged with forced bravado. "One cannot rouse the slumbering without a little desecration. A skull speaks louder than a sermon." Lovejoy, seated to the side, muttered darkly, and a cell door shuts louder still. The dramatist's confession, flamboyant though it was, sufficed. He admitted to stealing the skeleton from the museum's storeroom, admitted to planting it in market and churchyard, admitted to orchestrating the council chamber stunt with pulley and disguise. He insisted, however, that his acts were symbolic protest, not crime. Purbright let him talk, gathering every word. Only when the flow subsided did he close his notebook and say, "Mr. Chitterwick, symbolism will not spare you arraignment. You will answer before a magistrate, not an audience." That night, after the dramatist was locked away, Purbright returned to his office. The town outside buzzed with rumour. For some, Chitterwick had been revealed as a fool, for others, a martyr to neglected truth. And yet one question troubled Purbright still. Why Tobias Wraxall? Why had Chitterwick chosen that particular skeleton for his theatre of protest? He reopened the coroner's files. Tobias Wraxall had indeed died in obscurity, a clerk dismissed for incompetence, living alone until death by illness, no scandal, no intrigue, nothing to justify the dramatist's grand claims, unless Tobias had confided something to Chitterwick that never reached record, unless the bones themselves had been chosen for reasons personal rather than symbolic. As Purbright sat back, the faintest of smiles touched his lips. The performance was not over. Chitterwick's flamboyant confession had closed one act, but another was waiting. The true meaning of Tobias's restless wanderings still lay hidden behind the curtain. Inspector Purbright seldom allowed himself indulgence in speculation, yet as he stared at the neat stack of papers in his office, he felt certain that Aubrey Chitterwick had not chosen Tobias Wraxall's bones at random. There was a pattern, however faint, that linked dramatist to clerk, stage to skeleton. It had the faint smell of history buried too long. The following morning, he requested further archives from the municipal records. Clerks groaned and shuffled into basements, thick with dust. By noon, a box was placed before him, ledgers, correspondence, and a brittle, leather-bound journal once belonging to Wraxall. Purbright opened it gently. The handwriting was cramped, impatient, the scrawl of a man whose thoughts outpaced his pen. What emerged, however, was arresting. Tobias Wraxall, far from being a dim clerk, had been an auditor in the town treasury some 30 years prior. His dismissal, recorded blandly as for incompetence, concealed another story. He had discovered irregularities in the accounts, had written letters of warning, and had been swiftly silenced. The names he noted were of council members long deceased, but one was not. In a passage dated 1896, Tobias wrote bitterly of a Mr. S. Chitterwick, accused of misappropriation, protected by colleagues, never exposed. The entry ended with the words, "I am ruined and he prospers. My bones shall tell the tale when tongues fail." Purbright sat back. A generation earlier, Tobias had crossed paths with a Chitterwick, father perhaps, or uncle of Aubrey. The dramatist, rummaging through old theatre archives, must have stumbled upon this journal, linking his own family name with Tobias's tragedy. What began as research had become obsession, a theatrical crusade to vindicate the wronged clerk and punish the town that ignored him. The inspector carried his findings to the cell where Aubrey awaited charge. The dramatist looked rumpled, defiant, still performing for invisible galleries. "Mr. Chitterwick," Purbright began, laying the journal on the table, "your theatrics entertained the town, but what truly stirred you was not art, it was blood. Tobias accused a Chitterwick of theft, and you have spent years contriving vengeance in his name." The dramatist stiffened, his moustache bristling. "You read it, then?" His words, not mine. Tobias spoke across a century. I merely held the lantern to his shade. "You dug up his bones," Purbright said evenly. "That was no lantern. That was a desecration dressed as theatre." Aubrey's eyes burned. Desecration. He was forgotten. Tobias screamed for justice. And what justice did this town give? They buried him, branded him a fool. I gave him audience, gave him voice. If the Chitterwick name bore blame, then so be it. Better my family's disgrace than Tobias's silence. For a long moment, the inspector regarded him in silence. The passion was genuine, the madness woven with threads of truth. Tobias had been wronged, yes, but Aubrey had warped truth into spectacle, justice into carnival. "You might have brought his journal to light," Purbright said. "You might have published it, sought inquiry, pursued truth by honest means. Instead, you chose masquerade." Chitterwick laughed bitterly. "Honest means? You know Flaxborough, Inspector. It listens only when entertained. I did what I must, and they listened." He would say no more. That evening Purbright convened. With the mayor and town council, he laid the journal before them, read aloud the entries of Tobias Wraxall. Some blanched, others fidgeted. Though the accused councillor of old was long dead, the revelation was undeniable. Tobias had been sacrificed to protect the powerful. The past was stained. The mayor, perspiring under his collar, cleared his throat. "What is to be done, Inspector?" "Publish the truth," Purbright replied simply. "Correct the record, restore Tobias Wraxall's name. Let him rest." The council squirmed, but none dared object. For once, the law and public appetite aligned. Tobias would have his vindication. A week later, under calmer skies, the real skeleton was interred quietly, without torches or violins. A simple stone was raised, carved with his name, and the words, "Clark, wronged, remembered." Only a modest crowd attended, no theatrics, no banners. Purbright himself stood silent at the edge, hat in hand, watching the earth close gently over bones that had wandered too far. As for Aubrey Chitterwick, the magistrate pronounced sentence with weary clarity: 6 months' imprisonment for theft and public mischief. His defenders called him a martyr, his critics a lunatic, but in his cell he appeared almost content. He had wanted an audience, and he had received one. Whether Flaxborough loved or despised him, it could not forget him. In the police station some days later, Lovejoy dropped a newspaper on Purbright's desk. "Seems the town's split, sir. Half reckon Chitterwick a visionary, other half want him tarred and feathered. No shortage of letters to the editor." Purbright smiled faintly. "That is the nature of theatre, Sergeant. It divides, but it makes us look." Lovejoy grunted. "And what about Tobias?" "Think he'll finally keep quiet?" The inspector gazed out of the window, where spring sunlight touched the rooftops. "I believe so. He has been given back his name. That is all the dead ever ask of us, that we remember them truthfully." The case closed quietly, without parades or scandal. Yet in Flaxborough the tale endured. Children whispered of the skeleton that walked. Playgoers quoted Chitterwick's wild declamations. Old men muttered of councils crooked and clerks betrayed. The truth, at last, had mingled with legend, and in that mingling Tobias Wraxall found his strange immortality. For Inspector Purbright, it was another reminder that crime wore many masks, not only greed and violence, but also vanity, grievance, and the hunger for applause. He filed the journal away, switched off the lamp, and stepped into the evening air. The town, chastened yet amused, settled once more into its routines. And Tobias Wraxall, at long last, was left to his rest,